Jujutsu Kaisen Chapter 236 review. And this is the infamous Gojo death chapter. There's no getting around it, and that's the takeaway here. This is probably the biggest chapter in Jujutsu Kaisen's history, at least in popularity, that's for sure. And I had a few problems with this chapter, well less so this chapter, more so the fight in general, and I'll get into that later, but for the most part, I do think this is a good fight and a good part of the series. And this chapter opened up with Gojo in the afterlife seeing Geto for the first time since he killed him, and he tells Geto, kind of comedically, man, I told my students when you die alone, so I'm hoping this is my imagination. And Gojo and Geto are back to their old dynamic, and Geto asks, how was the king of curses? And Gojo says, this guy was insanely strong and he wasn't even giving it his all. And even if he didn't have 10 shadows, I think it would have been damn close. And that statement is going to upset a lot of people, but there is something Gege is trying to say here. There is a purpose behind this dialogue beyond power scaling, where Gojo says, I still feel sorry for him. I am no stranger to feeling isolated. There was always a gulf between me and other people, even when they adored me. And then Gojo starts to give us context to the way he was acting and talking towards Sukuna the entire time. Gojo stating, I put everything I could in trying to get him to understand my training, my body, my ability to use my technique, even my attempts at humor. I gave it my all, but it was not enough. The one who will teach you about love is, and it cuts off to Gojo saying, I had fun. And the thing here is that, Gojo tried his hardest to make Sukuna understand what it's like to be equal with somebody, and he tried to reach him, but he couldn't because they're just not. And I want to take a step back to Yoruzu's fight, because when Yoruzu talks about love to Sukuna, Sukuna seems to already know what this is. And in the Gojo vs Sukuna fight, we see that the first time and only time Sukuna was ever nervous was when he was about to lose Mahoraga. But the interesting thing about the dialogue in this case, and first of all, this is a Hunter x Hunter reference to Netero blowing himself up and the king feeling fear for the first time. But more importantly, it says for the first time in 1,000 years, and that compiled with Yoruzu's statements, it sounds like Sukuna ran into somebody in the past who did teach him love. That Ryomen Sukuna was not always unrivaled. And I think this is pretty major because Kenjaku's whole plan is having him coexist with Yuji Itadori, because the latent potential of Yuji Itadori, whatever Kenjaku did, whoever this guy used to be or was made from, that is probably the one who either previously taught Sukuna about love or will teach him about love in the future. And in Jujutsu Kaisen, from the words of Gojo Satoru, there is no curse more twisted than love. And Sukuna is the king of curses, and the one who is trying to understand what a curse truly is Yuji Itadori. And rereading those chapters and then rereading this fight and Gojo's final words, or at least his afterlife words, I think it did hit differently for me because I think he plays into the themes of the story even when his arc is concluded. Sometimes you just gotta step away from the power scaling, but Gege Akatame is trying pretty hard to tell the reader that Gojo was always going to lose, because Gojo Satoru was never the one intended to teach Sukuna about love. And let's talk more about Gojo's conclusion here, because we see him with everyone he knew who died, pretty much, except for Nobara. So take that delivery of Nobara copium as you will. And we have Haibara and Nanami telling Gojo they sympathize with him because Gojo never really cared about protecting people or keeping sorcery going, he just got a kick out of it. And they all thought that about Gojo, and that's why they could never just leave everything to him, because at the end of the day, Gojo is kind of selfish. And they talk about how they died, and Nanami says curses can bring people back to life just like Jujutsu. And we see that with things like Yuta dragging Rika's soul into, a quote-unquote Shikigami. And then Nanami proceeds to talk about a time that he asked Mei, should I move north or south? And she told him, if you want to be a completely new person, move north. And if you want to remain the same person, go south. And my interpretation of this, with all of the Buddhist elements in JJK, is that they are talking about achieving enlightenment or samsara versus being stuck in the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Or in this case, you either go north or you go south. And Nanami says, despite being somebody who always looked towards the past, he's ready to look towards the future. And we see Gojo internalizing what Nanami said before he yells out to Principal Yaga saying, hey, didn't you tell me a sorcerer never dies without regrets? Before we get multiple panels of Gojo's friends that he knew as a student, as he says, I hope this isn't a dream. And if this isn't a dream, like everybody else, it sounds like Gojo chose North because he has no regrets and has no reason to go back into the cycle of suffering and rebirth. And then cut to see Gojo either dead or very close to dead, and Sukuna is standing over him, explaining that Mahoraga's adaptation begins the moment it is introduced to a new phenomena, and further introductions of that type of phenomena accelerate the adaptation. And once it is finished adapting, it does not stop, and what Sukuna wanted was a model of how to tear through Gojo's infinity that he could replicate. And an interesting bit of information here is that the initial adaptation to infinity was done by changing the nature of Mahoraga's curse energy. And this is something we see with things like foreign curse tools that have different cursed energy on them that also bypass infinity. Your 6 eyes surely recognize the foreign cursed energy emanating from this tool. And we then get Sukuna saying that the second adaptation was something he could replicate, in that unlike sending slashes outwards like he does, Mahoraga instead targeted everything in the space before it unleashed its slashes, so when they manifested, they hit everything occupying it. So Gojo's infinity didn't do anything for him because there was no projectile to slow down, the slash was already on top of him. And this is in line with the previous stated targeting mechanics of Cleave and Dismantle and Sukuna's previously showcased ability to project his techniques like the barrier onto open space. And Sukuna looks at Gojo like an absolute psychopath and says, "You did a great job. I will never forget you for as long as I live." And this part cements Sukuna as the premier motherfucker of this entire series. Everybody wants this guy dead. Yuji already wanted him dead, but now he just took his sensei from him. Yuta and Maki look like they are about to cry, but they are also pissed, and they want Sukuna's head on a pike. And even if it does work, Kenjaku is still finishing his merger plan, a plan he never intended to make a move on until today. Kenjaku is like the last person on Earth to ever tell the truth to anybody, and he has plans for Yuji. There is a plot twist coming. As far as I know, usually when these stories enter their final arcs, the actual magazine will make an announcement of some kind. And the conclusion to the Save Megami mini arc, which is what I'm going to consider this from now on, that's probably where we enter the next arc and the final stages of Jujutsu Kaisen's story. And at the end of this chapter, the narration says, sparing no time to mourn the death of Gojo Satoru, Hajime Kashimo, the God of Thunder, approaches. So we're going to watch this dude crack open the fucking sky and then summon down Kirin and then get obliterated. Or Sukuna will open up the maximum max elephant water hose attack. And Sukuna's time, it is coming, because this is the guy now who killed Gojo Satoru. This guy does not get a happy ending. All I'm saying is, wherever Gojo went, he ain't going there. This guy's soul straight to the warp. And initially reading this chapter, I had some problems with Gojo's death, but on reread, I do like it a lot more because Gojo dying as Gojo Satoru and not just the strongest, it not only humanized him a lot for me, but he struggled with his identity of having to be the strongest, of having to carry everything on his shoulders and not being good enough. And I think that's why he's happy that he just died to a guy who was insanely strong, and he no longer has this burden of having to take care of everything on his shoulders. Gojo did what no one else could do. He went up against Ryomen Sukuna, he fought him in the 1v1 and did a pretty damn good job. I've seen people call him the Infinity Merchant. I mean, come on, who else is front running against Ryomen Sukuna? This guy is like 28 years old. And I've seen people talk about the space slash. Sukuna said this interpretation was incredibly hard to pull off, and we only see Sukuna do it once, and Mahoraga does it once. It even took Sukuna a while to figure out the interpretation because he didn't pull it out against Gojo in chapter 235, so I really wouldn't expect this to be a spammable attack because that's not how it's presented. And when all else fails, trust in the wild card that is Kashimo, because he's probably going to be crucial to them actually pulling any kind of W over this guy. I'm sorry, you don't get a previously set up hidden technique in anime and get called the Thunder God on your entrance and not blast some ass. JJK's fandom is in a state of turmoil after Gojo's death, which was pretty much inevitable no matter how he died. And I'll be making some more Yuji videos because Yuji is really at his lowest point here. His sensei is dead, Megami is seemingly gone forever, and he blames himself and his time to shine is coming. So if you like content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, thanks for watching.